If you want to write stories your readers will love, there are 3 things you need to do. Understand storytelling principles, see how other writers have applied those principles, and then use them in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. My name is Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for, and about women.
And I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor, and poet, and I have a passion for spy stories, fairy tales, and master detective novels.
On today's episode, Melanie pitched The Wife so that we can study stakes. This 2017 film was directed by Bjorn L. Runge from a screenplay by Jane Anderson, and it's based on the novel by Meg Wolitzer. Of course, there will be spoilers, and it's big spoilers this week, because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie. As always, we would love it if you could give the show a rating and review. For podcast listeners, you can do it right from your phone. Simply go to the show's landing page and scroll to the bottom. Click the 5 stars. It's that simple. All right, Melanie, what do you have for the genre this week?
So this week, I have the global genre as status sentimental. And I think it's because Joan's arc resolves her conflict around being at peace with her definition of success and failure. So with Jo gone, she has a level of control over the legacy that they leave and the inner satisfaction of knowing that they won the Nobel Prize together. So that's part of my justification of why I've chosen that particular genre for the global, and it is an internal genre as well. So it's just worth noting that. Then for my secondary genre, I have a love marriage story, and I've chosen that because the secondary genre, and Joan's inner struggle in her primary genre are directly linked to her marriage with Jo, and the symbiotic nature of their relationship, professionally and personally, is really at the crux of the conflict for her. And it means that her inner conflict directly impacts their marriage. So that's why I've chosen that. What about, I haven't looked at yours this week, so what have you got?
Well, for the global genre, I agree. It's an internal, it's all about what's happening inside Joan. I came up with a worldview education because I think in the end, Joan seems to decide that it's not as important as she thought it was for the public to know who wrote the books. What's most important is that she and Jo did love each other in their own way, and they had a life and a family together. She does decide, though, that it's important for her children to know the truth. So in terms of Joan's character, that doesn't change that much. I mean, she's stoic at the beginning, she's stoic at the end. I think what does change is how she sees the situation. Now, this is something that's really important. I can see why you came up with what you came up with 100%. And we're both looking at where she started at the beginning, where we think she's landed at the end. But this is a mini plot story.
Mm-hmm.
It's a beautiful example of a mini plot story. So the ending is not as closed as it would be in an arc plot story. So it's not a totally wide open ending, but it's not like the Lego Batman version of closed either. Right? So that's
Right.
where the variation in the interpretation comes in. So what Meg Wolitzer had in her mind or what Jane Anderson had in her mind, we don't know. They might have had something very specific in their minds when they were writing their versions of this story. What we're seeing as a result of that is changing. And that's the beauty of a well-crafted story. The secondary genre, love marriage. That's what I have too.
Yeah. So it's interesting, isn't it, that we've both picked up on the internal and then that love marriage. But I was really fascinated too this week at how much interplay there was between the 2 genres of the story. And I think we're both going to drill down a little bit more about that in our topic areas this week, because I know I do.
I'm projecting a long episode.
Yeah, there's a lot to say.
Lots to say. All right, take it away, Melanie.
Rightio. Okay. Now, before we start looking at the stakes in The Wife, I think we need to discuss the plot and how the order of events are revealed in this story. The wife is a masterclass in plotting and when also to reveal information. So for me, this movie plays out like a mystery because the inciting incident is revealed later in the film and the climactic events of the movie have their origins in events that happened 40 years prior to the start point of the movie. Now, the director has made sure that viewers know less than the characters, and this is how the mystery in this movie is created. And this is one form of narrative device used to create narrative drive. So we know something's not right with Joan, and we see this through her increasing frustration and simmering anger and resentment towards Jo as the presentation of Jo's Nobel Prize for Literature draws closer. This isn't just the frustration in a long-standing marriage. Jo is functionally incompetent in life, and I really think that's a very good description of him. And so how can someone who has that little awareness of everything around him write, and this is a quote from the movie, write with extraordinary intimacy, wit and depth? And this is in reference talking to Jo. So you have also challenged the novelistic form in ways that will affect generations of writers to come. So how can this be when we see what Jo's like and then we hear the description of the literary works that he creates? Now, Jo and Joan know what's going on, but none of the other characters know, and neither do the audience. So the mystery is set up subtly, but it's there and it's compelling to watch. However, the director can only keep this up for so long. The viewers must be let into what's going on. Now, this isn't a mystery story, so we don't expect a big denouement at the end, but imagine the impact of the story and what impact it would have had on the story if the story had been told in chronological order. There would be the Jo and Joan meet cute and and then their arrangements to write together. Then we'd skip over 45 years of marriage to get to the point where Jo has been awarded the Nobel Prize. So if we'd watched the story in this way, then Joan's internal conflict would have been sensed before it was revealed. And then I think the story would have been less powerful. Now, the story in the book is told in a similar but slightly different way, and there's more detail around Jo and Joan's relationship with their children, and a lot more about Joan's internal monologue and her dialogue with herself. Now, I've got to ask Valerie, what did you make of the way the information is revealed in The Wife?
I have to say I agree with everything you just said there. This is masterful. Authors always struggle with exposition and information dumps, and I keep saying that the reader, or in this case the viewer, is on a need-to-know basis. Only tell them what they need to know in order to understand what's happening in that particular moment. The Wife follows that approach. And just as you said, we are constantly wondering what's going to happen next. The narrative is constantly being driven forward. And just like you said, you got to bring the reader into it, or the viewer into it at the right time. You can't just leave them dangling. And that's what happens. They do that. This is such a well-written film. It just is.
So in most movies that we watch, the protagonist's object of desire is revealed in the first act. And it appears to be the case in The Wife. Now, Jo's object of desire is realised in the opening minutes of the movie, and he's been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. And in my opinion, that's pretty much the highest achievement a writer could aspire to get. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because the objects of desire establish what's at stake. So think about this. What could be at stake for Joe or Joan if Joe has won the Nobel Prize? Well, here we come to the confessional moment of the episode. Now, I think I've been thinking about stakes the wrong way. And the reason for this is because there is no good definition or detailed description of stakes and how they work in stories. And what I'm trying to do by picking this topic for this season is provide you and myself with a clearer definition and description of stakes. And to be honest, I'm finding out that this is a bit of a trial and error process right now. Another definition that I found this week, or that I read this week, was from HR DaCosta's Scribe Meets World website. And HRD, as she likes to be called, defines stakes as the negative consequences of failure. Now, again, this just doesn't seem adequate to me. It's okay, don't get me wrong, it's okay, but it's just not adequate. And I mentioned in last week's episode that I'd read Christopher Vogler's sort of description in The Writer's Journey of what stakes are, and I'm going to quote it again. And he says, for readers and viewers to be involved in the adventure, to care about the hero, they have to know at an early stage exactly what's at stake. In other words, what does the hero stand to gain or lose in the adventure? What will be the consequences for the hero, society, and the world if the hero succeeds or fails? Now, as I mentioned last week, I like this description because it links the loss, gain, and the consequences together. But I do think there's more. Now, why am I digging deep into this? Well, because phrases like what's at stake and raise the stakes are thrown around in the writing world with wild abandon. And there's an assumption that we all know as writers what the stakes are. But I'm not sure that that's the case exactly. So here is my latest explanation for stakes. So we'll see how this goes. And feedback is welcome. So, message me, tweet me if you have an opinion on what I'm about to say. So here we go. The object of desire is what's at stake for a character. So it's what they have to lose or gain. But what happens through a story is a series of progressive complications that are risk events along the spectrum of possible events that will either move the character closer or further away from their object of desire. The progressive complications have likelihoods and consequences. When writers raise the stakes, what's really meant is that writers increase the severity of the consequences of the complications, and we increase the likelihood of those consequences impacting the character's ability to obtain their object of desire. Right, so now, again, it's a work in progress, but I'm reasonably happy with that sort of description of what's going on and how stakes work with objects of desire and the progressive complications in a story. So, it's getting there, it's getting there. So let's go back and look at the objects of desire and the stakes in The Wife. Joan's object of desire at the beginning of the movie could be Joe Castleman. So Joan is the supportive wife, and Joe is the greatest living author of the 20th century. However, the nature of the marital relationship is clearly presented. The setup here is outstanding because Joan gives Joe what he wants, always at the expense of what she wants. And we see this in the intimate relationship in their bedroom. It's core and foundational to their relationship, but it doesn't tell us what's at stake for Joan or Joe. Now, when Joe gets the call about winning the Nobel Prize, what we are seeing is the realization of Joe's object of desire. He's getting what he wants, but we still don't know what's at stake. We do know from experience, however, that if a movie starts with a pinnacle event, then it's pretty much going to go downhill from there. And the anticipation comes from wanting to watch the downfall. And that's really what keeps us watching. Now, as the couple travel to Stockholm for the ceremony, it seems like Joan wants to support her husband and stop him from embarrassing himself in the lead up to the presentation of the prize. But really, Joan's object of desire remains a mystery until we see the flashbacks. So Joan is an aspiring writer at university at probably the age of 18, 19, and Joe is her professor. And so we start to see this part of their story and their history revealed. Now we jump forward again and we meet Nathaniel. So Joe and Joan's body language clearly show us that Nathaniel's object of desire, which is to write write his biography, is not one that they are in favour of. But Joan warns Joe that he doesn't want to make an enemy of Nathaniel because, and I quote, "There's nothing more dangerous than a writer whose feelings have been hurt." And oh my God, is that not the truth? Is that not the truth of this movie right there? And it's true. This is, if you wanted a sentence that sort of summed up in some part what this movie is about, I think that's a really good quote that could really tell you what's going on here. Right. So when you watch this movie for the first time, you know that there are many simmering emotions beneath the surface, but you don't know what they are. Now, the significant tension between Joe and David is there, and we see some of this come out in the scenes where the winners of the Nobel Prizes introduce their children, and it is really quite uncomfortable. But this scene reveals to us that the Nobel Prize winners have very similar narcissistic traits. Neither Joe nor James Finch are willing to let their children be better than them. However, they also both have brilliant wives. And I think this plays out a little bit into objects of desires as well, right? They don't want people to be better than them, and they don't believe now, as recipients of the Nobel Prize, that at that point in time there is anybody better than them potentially. Now, we also know that David wants to be a writer and he seeks his father's approval. Now, he has approval from his mother, but he really wants it from his father. And David's faith in his own ability as a writer is at stake. If he gets his father's approval, then he will be encouraged to keep writing. If he doesn't, then he is in a bind because he wants to be a writer. Now, I know I'm focused on stakes, but I just want to point out that every line of dialogue in this movie is ammunition, and it all contributes to the final explosion. When we think about it, all the dialogue is about Joan's stake, or what's at stake for her, but we don't realise it at the time it's being said. Now, Valerie, can I ask what you thought about the dialogue in The Wife and how you think that compares to other films that we've watched this season and over the course of the show?
It's funny that you mentioned dialogue because I also highlighted that this week. The dialogue in The Wife is brilliant. It is just brilliant. And like you said, on the first viewing, you pick up some of the brilliance. I mean, you can see that it's sharp, it's crisp, it's clear, all that kind of stuff. But the full meaning of it doesn't hit you until you get all the way to the end. It's so much more powerful on subsequent viewings. Now, personally, I think the best way to understand dialogue and how it works, honestly, is to just study plays and well-written films like this one. Through the dialogue, we get all of the clues that we need to understand what's going on with Joan, what her objects of desire are, what's at stake for her, all her internal stuff, and there's a lot of internal stuff that's happening here. And we can see it because Glenn Close is a genius. So through the dialogue, we get all of the clues that we need in order to understand what's happening inside Joan, what her thoughts are, her feelings are, without either the novelist or the screenwriter having to explicitly state it. Now, let me give you some examples of what I mean. Joe is supposed to be the great writer, the one with the mastery of words. And as you say, Melanie, someone who is praised for his wit, right? Yet his dialogue, the words that are actually coming out of his mouth, are crass. He says of his son, David, let's hope he gets laid while he's here. Is that the stuff of a Nobel Prize winning author? Someone who's praised for his use of words. Now, contrast this to Joan's dialogue. She's supposed to be the wallflower, the one who's standing in the background, in the shadows, just holding his coat or brushing the crumbs from his beard or keeping him from embarrassing himself and totally. Yet her dialogue is witty and sparkly. When the Nobel Committee rep apologizes for waking them at an ungodly hour, Joan says, "Not ungodly at all. It added 10 years to my husband's life." Joe says he's low maintenance, and Joan quips, "Only when he's asleep." Now, not only do Joan's words enable us to easily believe that, oh, and here's the big spoiler, everybody, that she is actually the author of the Nobel Prize winning body of work. But the prize actually has not added 10 years to Joe's life at all. It ends his life. He's low maintenance only when he's asleep, but in death, he will not be low maintenance at all because Joan now has to embark on her journey of protecting his legacy because there are people like Nathaniel who, are sniffing out the truth here. They'll continue to raise doubts, and as a result, Joan is going to spend the rest of her life convincing the world that Joe really was the author of those books. Now, if you only ever watch Marvel movies and that kind of thing, you will never be able to craft dialogue at this level because you won't develop an ear for it and you won't understand how powerful dialogue is as a storytelling tool. Now, I'm not saying that to knock Marvel because they're a hoot and a half. The spectacle is amazing, but the storytelling, we all know, we have to admit this, we have to say it out loud, the storytelling's lame. It just is. So, Marvel movies and that type of story where it's all surface, it's very thin storytelling, they're not particularly helpful to serious writers who want to learn the craft. If you want to write a story with the depth and the breadth and the emotion and all that other wonderful juicy stuff that's in The Wife, then that's the kind of stories you got to sink your teeth into. By all means, enjoy the Marvel movies and that sort of stuff. Because like I said, they're fun. They're just fun. Come on. But if you want to improve dialogue, then listen, The Wife is a great film to study, not just watch, but study.
Oh yeah, it is, isn't it? And the dialogue is, just so good, and it just gets better on second and third viewings. Which, as any writer, you want people to get them going back and finding new things. I think is a masterful accomplishment. And in this movie, we do see that Joan's dialogue is heavily infused with her inner conflict, which is a direct result of the decisions that she made years ago. Now, she is living with the consequences of her decisions at this point in the movie. And once we know what's going on, we can see the dialogue and the events in the first half of the movie have signaled the change in Joan's object of desire. So once this changes, then what's at stake for Joan becomes much clearer. Then we get a glimpse of what Joan's object of desire is. And it is really, at times, she just doesn't want to be seen as the long-suffering wife because she isn't. So this is masterful and complex writing. The subtlety of the simmer just takes my breath away when I watch this. And so, how did we get here? Well, we see young Joan discussing writing with the author Elaine Mazel, and we understand now, when we see this, how to build a picture of Joan's object of desire. So, Elaine's advice to Joan is the first large obstacle that threatens Joan's object of desire. So, what's at stake for Joan is being read. A writer needs to be read, and Elaine really puts this out there for her. So, Joan wants to be a successful writer, but the risk event is if no one reads your books, then you won't be successful. Elaine lays out the likelihood of that happening and the consequences of only 1,000 copies sold. Now, Elaine and also the publishers at Joan's Work also make it clear that as a female writer, no matter how good you are, you'll be a novelty and never taken seriously in the male-dominated world of publishing. So, wow, just wow. It is pretty much put out there without being so blatantly said. Now, the role of Nathaniel's object of desire in the movie is fundamental to revealing what's going on in Joan's head, because Nathaniel's desire is to write a book about Jo, and this has led him to research Jo's work and Joan's work. So he puts his theory that Joan is the author of Jo's books to Joan. Joan, however, doesn't confirm Nathaniel's theory, but it provides shade to understanding what her object of desire is and what's at stake for her with Jo being awarded the Nobel Prize. At the same time, we also see that Jo can't function without Joan. His dependence on her is really laid bare when she doesn't accompany him to the rehearsal for the ceremony. So the cross-section of the stakes in this movie is pretty amazing. But what became apparent by the end of this movie is that Jo and Joan's objects of desire are the same or similar when they meet. What changed over time was the consequences of their arrangement, and this leads to a change in the object of desires and the stakes throughout the movie. So Jo's object of desire is to maintain the status quo, because if he is revealed to be only half of the writing team, then all the kudos and all his credibility will be gone. This is what's at stake for Jo. And if the truth comes out, Joan will not necessarily be gifted the same recognition as Jo, and the scandal would be damning for them both. Now, at the end of the movie, Joan is the one who decides what success and failure are for her, so she no longer must pandle to Jo, but she is the keeper of the legacy, and she has the choice to step out of his shadow or not. Now, she has succeeded because she knows deep down that she has really won the Nobel Prize. Now, so why are the stakes revealed in this way? Now, in my opinion, it all comes back to the type of story that you're telling. The King's Speech, for example, is a performance story, so the object of desire are going to be there from the beginning, and that is really important for that genre. In The Godfather, this is a society political story with strong internal genre for the primary protagonist. Now, the objects of desire, the complications and the consequences of those complications are key to understanding the fall and the rise of the Corleones and the price the other mafia families pay. The change to Michael's object of desire halfway through is also essential to understanding what's at stake for him and why his actions change. So The Wife is an internal genre or a mini plot story. So the realization of what's at stake via the objects of desire at the end of the story makes sense. We need to travel on this journey with Joan to have the insight and to have her rage simmer silently through her facial expressions and her words. So what's at stake for Joan then? Well, there are two competing things at stake for Joan, and they are both internal. Joan has put herself in a double bind. And what are they? Well, she wants recognition for her work. She is the Nobel laureate for literature, not Jo. So her stakes here are her reputation. But if she gets the recognition she deserves, she will ruin Jo's reputation, and she'll also be the subject of pity, and she doesn't want to be pitied. So what's at stake for Jo? Well, as I mentioned before, it's his lie. He will be completely derided and become irrelevant and disgraced for the farce he's been, promoting for approximately 40 years. And the literary world does not forgive betrayals easily. And you just have to look at cases like A Million Little Pieces by James Frey and many other examples to understand how deep those wounds are felt in that community. Now, in The Wife, the stakes also go deeper than just scandal and recognition. Jo and Joan's relationship is symbiotic. He has the ideas and she has the skill, and this is the foundation upon which they have built their lives. So what's at stake for them both is the foundation of their married life. Jo and Joan have the same stakes, but if they are found out, then the consequences are different for each of them. And the Nobel Prize is the catalyst for the final breakdown in their marriage and the farce that is their writing life. By the end of the movie, Joan has decided to maintain Jo's reputation and maintain the farce in the public arena. However, like Valerie mentioned, she does want to tell her children the truth. Now, at first glance, The Wife seems to be a moving feast of smaller personal stakes. However, by the end, and upon subsequent viewings, we see that all the micro movement in stakes are really subsets or events that threaten Jo and Joan's body of work and their marriage. The two sets of stakes are so intertwined that they can't be pulled apart without the other suffering. So here's a summary, or my summary, of how I think the stakes work in The Wife. So the objects of desire are what's at stake. Joan and Jo share the same object of desire at the beginning of the chronological story. But when only Jo is recognised for their joint effort, their individual objects of desire start to threaten their shared object of desire. We see how the progressive complications created by their secret have manifested resentment towards each other, and the consequences of their initial decision have become so large that it threatens to destroy them individually and as a couple. Right, so this week has been really hard work for me, and I'm pretty exhausted, to be honest with you. But I really like where I'm going with understanding stakes. Now, I think before I lead into you, Valerie, I think, I'm really keen to hear how this movie created empathy and what it did and where empathy sort of sat for you, so that I can go and have a break from from thinking about stakes for a minute. So how did you go? And did you think it was a really good example of building empathy for your characters?
I have to thank you, Melanie, because you gave me an easy one this week. I empathized with Joan in the first minute of this film, and my empathy only grew as the story went on. Now, in saying this, honestly, I'm wondering whether men empathize with Joan quite as much. And I say this because the movie took 14 years to make and these are reasons that Glenn Close has stated publicly many times, It took 14 years to make the movie because, one, the male-run studios would not fund a movie about a wife. I'm not kidding. I'm really not kidding. And also, they could not find a male actor, because you need a name, right, attached to the movie to get the fund, blah, blah, blah. They couldn't find a man, an actor, willing to play the part of Joe. Now, many journalists, because I love this movie so much, I've just been in the wife rabbit hole all week. Many journalists have called Jonathan Pryce brave for having taken on the role. Now, I would really like to know what the heck is so brave about it. I mean, he does a great job, don't get me wrong. But why does it have to be brave to be the arsehole in the marriage, to be not the big star, and to be the husband in a movie called The Wife? It's 2023. Why does that have to be brave? Anyhow, I'm really curious to hear from listeners because, Melanie, you and I are both girls. We're both wives. So I'm curious to hear from the gentlemen in our audience. Do you empathize with Joan? Message me on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. Let the deluge of messages begin. The Wife is one of the best films I have seen in a very long time. The trend in movies lately, and we've discussed this many times here on the show, I've already mentioned it on this episode, the emphasis is on what I call spectacle. And there's little to no storytelling. There's lots of CGI, and there's Chris Hemsworth's abs, but there's not much else. And those movies are fun. But we also need movies like The Wife. In fact, we need lots of them, far more than we have. The screenplay for this film has been brilliantly crafted. I cannot understate that. Kudos to Jane Anderson for adapting the novel, and kudos to the principal actors and the director for bringing their talents to it as well. The more I watched the movie this week, the better it got. And it was pretty amazing the first time through. I'm putting The Wife in the same category as The King's Speech, in that it's a story that we, as writers, can turn to for excellent examples of all kinds of storytelling principles. We already talked about dialogue, but if you want to know how to develop or reveal character, this is a great movie to study. If you want to know how to construct a plot, this is a great movie to study. Basically, if you want to know how to do pretty much anything, this is a great movie to study. I was so impressed by the film that this week I read the novel, or rather I listened to it because my eyes aren't yet ready for a lot of reading. And a quick side note here, for those of you who don't know, in March I had eye surgery. Laser beams and needles in eyeballs is not for the faint of heart, let me tell you. I was told I'd have 2 days of downtime. It's now 6 weeks and I'm still recovering. They're now telling me 3 to 6 months. So if you've emailed me and I haven't responded, or you're on my mailing list and you're wondering why I've stopped messaging, or you're wondering why my social media suddenly just went quiet, it's because my eyes still have a really low tolerance for screens and even lower tolerance for text on a page. I am getting better. It's just taken a while. So please bear with me. There's nothing wrong with my ability to talk, though. I'm just fine there. All right. So in the novel, The Wife, Joan is more cynical and she's more bitter, or at least that's the way that the voice actor is performing it. So I'm curious, when my eyes will allow me to actually read the text. It's first-person narrative, which makes sense for this kind of story because so much of it is going on inside Joan's heart and mind. In the film, then, we're relying on Glenn Close and her amazing acting chops to convey Jo's internal thoughts and feelings, and she really does it well. She really does it well. And it's mini plot, as I said. Just contrast this to The Accidental Tourist. This is so much more interesting as a mini plot story than The Accidental Tourist. But see, Melanie, this is about what's going on in a woman's head and heart and mind Whereas, and I'm empathizing with it totally, I had trouble with the accidental tourist because I just wanted Macon to get off his rear end and get to work. That's about a guy's emotional turmoil. So, that could be the difference here. I don't know. All right, empathy. I said that I had empathy for Joan in the first minute. Why? Well, it's because the opening scene has been crafted so well that Joe reveals himself to be an immature, selfish, narcissistic jackass. And Joan, who just wants to get a good, decent night's sleep, is having to deal with an all too common dilemma. Sorry, guys, this is the truth. Joe is waiting for a call to find out if he's won the Nobel Prize, and he cannot sleep. So what does he do? Well, first he goes and eats a bunch of food he's not supposed to eat, especially given his health issues and his family history. As a man in his 60s, he is not yet mature enough to look after himself. Making poor dietary choices is a thing with him. It's throughout the whole movie, and Joan and their son David have to constantly correct him. Joe is like a little child here. So then he wakes Joan up. She's been sleeping fine, but he has no regard for her. He wakes her up to have sex with him. She doesn't want to. She says no. She just wants to go back to sleep for her health and her well-being. And he makes her feel bad about refusing him. She knows she's not going to be left alone until he gets his own way. So she lies there while he does his thing. All of this so that she can just go back to sleep. Now, we learned that when Joan was 19, that's when she met Joe. He was her English teacher. Melanie already mentioned this. She's now a woman in her 60s, and she's still having to put his needs ahead of her own. He is still demanding that she do so. And here's the thing. It's easy for us to pass this off as a generational thing. And to an extent it is, sure. For example, generally speaking, the men of my generation are far more engaged as fathers and far more supportive of their wives' careers than the men of my parents' generation. For my parents' generation, very few women even had careers outside the home. They worked inside the home as mothers and housewives, just like Joan is expected to do and does appear to be doing. However, even in 2023, a woman is still expected to defer to her husband. We don't like to think this is true, but look at the facts. A lot of people lost their jobs during COVID, and the majority of those people are women who were expected to leave work to care for the children. When a woman starts her own business, she has to do it herself, or she has to hire someone to help her. When a man starts his own business, his wife is expected to provide the administrative support. I see this around me everywhere, and I can list a dozen or more examples just in my own personal circle. I struggle, though, to find very many examples where the husband leaves his career to be a stay-at-home dad so that his wife can pursue her career. When it does happen, society thinks he's been emasculated. That's why it's so hard for men to do this. Society thinks that the wife is not being a good mother because they see her as having chosen her career over children. So it's really tough for a couple to make that choice, for the woman to be the breadwinner and the man to stay home. Joan wants to be a writer, but as a woman, she either won't get published or won't get read. If she wants to achieve that goal, she needs Joe. She needs to pass her work off as though it's his, because if the book has been written by a white male, it'll get taken seriously. Now, this is not a new idea. Marianne Evans wrote under the name George Eliot. The Bronte sisters wrote under the names Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. Elizabeth Gaskell wrote under the name Cotton Mather Mills. Louisa May Alcott, my beloved Louisa May Alcott, wrote under the name A.M. Bernard. Joanne Rowling, for pity's sake, was told to use her initials because it was thought that readers wouldn't buy a book written by a woman. Come on, guys. Now, since she doesn't have a middle initial, she used her grandmother's name, Kathleen, and so became J.K. Rowling, the most successful author in history. So it's still going on today. And outside publishing women across industries are not paid the same as men who do the same job. Do I empathize with Joan? Oh, you bet. This is the situation that Joan found herself in. She's both introverted and shy, and she has all this incredible literary talent that she's unable to express. Because she and Joe are kind of stuck together initially because of their affair, she takes stock of her situation and makes the best of it. Yes, she loves him, especially in the early days. And she does what a dutiful wife is supposed to do. She supports him in his career. She goes out and gets a job and pays all the bills while he stays home and writes. Now, Ian Rankin's wife, Miranda, did the same thing. I'm sure there are many examples of this. The difference, of course, is that Ian Rankin actually can write, and Joe, as it turns out, has no literary talent whatsoever. And he is so sensitive that he can't bear any feedback of any kind. All he wants is adoration. In the book version, it's Joan who has both the ideas and the ability to write. But in the film, it's presented as Joe being the one with the ideas and with something to say, and Joan who actually has the line writing skills. Now, in both versions, it's Joan who gets Joe's manuscript in front of the publisher. And when it's rejected, it's Joan who rewrites it and gets the first book, The Walnut, published. Anyway, so in the first minute of the film, our empathy is established. Well, mine is anyway. And it's established using a technique we haven't discussed yet so far this season. We talked about object of desire and motivation and environment and character development or character revelation. But the wife establishes empathy through a shared experience. Every woman I know who is married has gone through this. It is so common, we don't even recognize it for what it is. It is something that is expected of us as women, and it's simply assumed that we'll do it because that's what a quote-unquote good wife does, right? Don't even get me started with this, Melanie. Don't even get me started. I'm only warming up here. Okay.
This was always the risk of this episode.
Now, let me just pause here to say that I do not hate men. I really don't. And I don't think for a second that all men are like Joe. Far from it. But at 52, I have just had it with all of these old societal attitudes. Oh my God, Melanie, it's exhausting.
It is. I agree. It is tiring. And I think when you get to this age, you even have less tolerance for it than ever before in your life, right?
So the empathy that was established with the initial shared experience in that first minute is supported by the two clips that follow it immediately. And this is all before the title even appears on screen, by the way. We see Joan on the phone listening as Joe gets the news that he's won the Nobel Prize for Literature. We don't yet know that Joan is the real writer of the books, but from the look on her face, and Melanie, you alluded to this already, we know something's up here. Something is going on. We're reading so many emotions on Glenn Close's face that were full of questions. And none of the emotions is pride or joy for her husband. That's what's so interesting. At the end of the call, the committee rep tells Joan that she's going to need to take good care of Joe because once he's announced as the winner, he's going to be getting a lot of press. Now, the way these lines are delivered, the dialogue and the performance, make it clear that this is far more than one partner supporting another partner. Joan is like Joe's caregiver. She is subservient to him, and like you said, Melanie, he cannot function without her. He can't. The next scene is Joe jumping on the bed and singing like a little child, "I won the Nobel, I won the Nobel." Seriously. And he is clutching Joan's hands and making her jump with him. Now we see in a flashback that this is what they did when The Walnut was published. The difference is that at that time, Joan was still very mature in many ways. She was 19, and she still had Joe, who was her professor, on a pedestal. He hadn't yet broken her heart or had any of his many, many affairs. In their 60s, Joan has matured, but Joe has not. Grown men do not jump on beds like little boys. Joe also isn't giving Joan the credit. She is the one who has won the Nobel Prize. He hasn't. He's taking the reward without having done any of the work. Everything is about Joan. Joan is invisible, which so many women over 50 are. Now, if you're not a woman over 50, that's a tough statement to believe, but it's actually true. And if you are a woman over 50, you know exactly what I'm talking about here. Scene after scene, Joan's subservience is driven home. I could walk through the film scene by scene and explain it all, and initially I had planned to do that, but the notes for this episode got way too long. It would be a 2-hour episode. I struggle to keep it under an hour as it is. But I encourage you to study the wife scene by scene and see how they continue to build the audience's empathy with Joan. So the empathy that's initially established is becoming stronger and stronger. And at some point in the movie, I can't pinpoint exactly when, it becomes annoyance, even anger. But just as the anger is starting to kick in, our anger as audience, we see that Joan is getting angry too. And so we, as the audience, are united once again with this character. It's still a shared experience. It's just a different experience. There is a lingering question, though, and it's this. Why does Joan stay with him? Well, in the novel, the reasons why she stays are made clearer because we have full access to her thoughts. In the film, we don't really know the answer until the very end when she tells Nathaniel that if he disparages Joe's reputation and memory in any way, then she'll take him to court. So why does she stay? I think there's 2 reasons. I think she genuinely loves Joe. He's not all that, but she loves him. And 2, she doesn't have a career without him. So the wife is an excellent example of establishing empathy through a shared experience between the reader audience and the character. But it's not enough to have one scene that depicts a shared experience. It's the whole tale that's a shared experience. Anyway, Melanie, what's the action step for today?
All right. Well, this week, I want you to do something that I've done many times and it works, right? So I can testify that this works. So I want you to write down your character's object of desire, then list all of the progressive complications that could get in the way of them achieving this. Rank them in terms of severity of their consequences, and now you have a starting point for raising or reducing the stakes in your story.
And that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss As Good as It Gets. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For access to writing templates and worksheets and more than 70 hours of training, subscribe to my Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle and follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to get Melanie's tips about books to help you read like a writer, visit Melanie on Facebook and Instagram under Melanie Hill Author, or find out more about her at melaniehill.com.au. And remember, story theory does not have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.